Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're really trying to get inside what you might call the ultimate black box of modern geopolitics.
Mm.
We're talking about the semiconductor chip, that tiny microscopic world.
Yeah, it's fundamental. We hear a lot about trade wars, tariffs, the big picture stuff.
Right.
But we want to drill down into the actual physical reality, the silicon itself.
Right.
Because that's what shapes technological power today.
Let me just paint a picture for you. Think about a U.S. Navy destroyer, okay? Maybe the USS Mustin. It's sailing through the Taiwan Strait, really politically sensitive waters.
Yeah, a very visible symbol of power.
Exactly. But that ship, its real strength isn't just the steel hull or, the guns.
Oh, man, I didn't...
It's the computing power inside. The radar systems, satellite comms, those precision-guided weapons.
All computerized.
Every single one relies on these invisible switches, etched onto silicon wafers. That tiny piece of silicon, that's the real hardware of modern conflict.
That image is so important because it helps us frame the whole issue, the core idea driving this global competition right now.
Okay.
Think about World War II. That was largely about who could churn out the most steel, the most aluminum, heavy industry, basically.
Right. Tanks, planes, ships, mass production.
Exactly. But today, the rivalry shaping up between the U.S. and China, it might well be decided by who controls the most advanced computing power.
So it's shifted from metal to microchips.
Completely. Whether you're talking about advanced AI, machine learning, or self-driving cars, or the really cutting-edge drones and missiles.
Everything needs the best chips.
Everything needs the absolute best, the leading-edge semiconductors. Yeah. If you control the chip supply, you basically control the future direction of technology and maybe geopolitics too.
And when we talk about control, the scale and the concentration of this industry are just staggering. It's not just big, it's hyper-centralized.
Yeah.
You mentioned Taiwan. Let's zoom in there for a second. Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, TSMC, their factories, their fabs, they're literally building the architecture for the modern world.
The numbers involved, they almost don't make sense. You take a place like TSMC's Fab 18, they're etching patterns onto silicon, right?
No.
Using lithography.
Okay.
The scale is so small, the shapes they're making are tinier than like 1/100th the size of a mitochondrion in one of your cells.
Wow. That's hard to even imagine.
It really is. Think about the A14 chip, the one on the iPhone 12. On that single little chip, TSMC carved 11.8 billion transistors.
Billion on one chip.
Billion. Now here's the really wild number. Last year, the entire global chip industry produced more transistors, these little on-off switches.
Yeah.
More than the combined quantity of all other manufactured goods by all other companies in all other industries throughout all of human history.
Wait, say that again? More transistors than everything else ever made combined.
Combined. Screws, bricks, cars, books, everything. More transistors were made last year. Nothing else even comes close to that kind of scale and complexity.
Okay, when you put it like that, the stakes become incredibly clear. So that sets up our mission for this deep dive.
Right.
We need to unpack how we got here. How did this industry become so incredibly centralized, especially with the most critical manufacturing parked right there in East Asia?
And why has that concentration become such a flashpoint, this intense global competition, pitting U.S. strengths in design and machinery against China's massive push for self-sufficiency?
Exactly. We need to explore what it means when both economic growth and, frankly, national security depend on what happens inside a few hyper-complex clean rooms, many sitting right across the Taiwan Strait from mainland China.
Okay, so to really get the geopolitics today, you have to rewind way back to the basic physics even. Before we had transistors, computing relied on vacuum tubes.
Right, those big glass bulbs, glowing filaments inside, like old radios.
Exactly. They worked as switches, on or off, 1 or 0 for binary code. But they were just awful for computing. Huge, slow, they broke all the time, generated tons of heat.
So early computers were these massive room-filling things that needed constant fixing.
Constantly. The physical limits were a major roadblock. And that's where the whole story of the transistor really starts, at Bell Labs. They were looking for something solid, durable, to replace those fragile vacuum tubes.
A solid-state solution, I think they called it.
That's the term. William Shockley and his team, they had the theory. Using semiconductor materials like silicon or germanium, normally these things block electricity.
Okay.
But if you add tiny, precise amounts of impurities, it's a process called doping, you can chemically tweak the material so it does let current flow under certain conditions. Basically, a solid switch.
So that was the transistor. But the chip was the next step, right? Putting multiple things together.
Precisely. The integrated circuit, or chip. That leap came from Jack Kilby at Texas Instruments in '58, and almost simultaneously by Robert Noyce at Fairchild Semiconductor in '59.
And what did they figure out?
They found ways to put not just one transistor, but lots of components, resistors, capacitors, other transistors, all onto one single tiny piece, one chip of semiconductor material.
And who was the first big customer? Not exactly selling these on the high street yet, were they?
Oh, definitely not. The prices were astronomical. The crucial first buyer, the one who really drove the early development, was the U.S. military.
Makes sense. They always need the cutting edge.
In 1959, Texas Instruments sold some of their first integrated circuits to a U.S. Navy missile program. It was something like 64 chips for $1,000.
Wow, that's serious money back then for just a handful of components.
Absolutely. But the military wasn't buying them because they were cheap. They needed them because of physics, weight, and size.
Ah, okay. Miniaturization.
Every ounce counts in a missile or a plane. Think about the Air Force. They needed a new guidance computer for the Minuteman II submissile, carrying nuclear warheads.
High stakes.
Extremely. They needed something way lighter, faster, and tougher. Something that could handle the G-forces of launch. Kilby's integrated circuits from TI were the answer.
And the difference was dramatic, wasn't it?
Unbelievable. The final guidance system, using chips, could do twice the calculations. But the chips themselves weighed only 2.2 ounces.
Just over 2 ounces. Compared to what?
Compared to what would have been about 36 pounds of the older traditional hardware to do the same job.
36 pounds down to 2 ounces. That's not just an improvement. That's a total paradigm shift.
It absolutely was. It changed military engineering. Suddenly you're moving away from just brute physical size and weight towards mathematical efficiency packed into silicon. It opened the door for things like precision bombs, miniaturized spy satellites.
And NASA jumped on this too, right? For the Apollo program.
Right behind the military. Apollo relied heavily on chips from Fairchild, Noyce's company. If you compare the computer on Apollo 11, the one that guided them to the moon, compare that to the ENIAC computer from World War II, which filled a huge room. The Apollo computer was 1,000 times smaller and lighter, weighed about 70 pounds, fit in a box roughly a cubic foot.
Incredible. And reliable enough for space travel.
That was key. They proved the tech could work in extreme environments, space, missile silos where failure just wasn't an option. That military and space agency demand, even at high prices, really kickstarted everything.
So that initial military spending laid the groundwork, but then things really took off, didn't they? This leads us to Gordon Moore.
Exactly. 1965. Gordon Moore, he was one of the founders of Fairchild, later co-founded Intel. He noticed this incredible trend.
What did he see?
He saw that the number of components, transistors, mostly that you could fit onto a chip, was roughly doubling every year.
Doubling every single year.
Yeah, and he predicted it would continue. That observation, it got written up and became famous as Moore's Law. It predicted this relentless shrinking, leading to things he imagined back then, like an electronic wristwatch or personal portable communications equipment.
He basically predicted the smartphone way back in '65.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
But here's a crucial point that often gets missed. The military, they funded the invention. But it was the civilian market that provided the sheer scale needed to keep Moore's Law going for decades.
Ah, okay. So the demand shifted.
Massively.
Yeah.
In 1965, defense spending still bought something like 72% of all integrated circuits. Huge chunk. But Robert Noyce at Fairchild, he saw the future wasn't just government contracts. It was mass markets.
So he went commercial.
Aggressively. He slashed prices. A chip that cost $120 in 1961. By 1962, it was down to $15. That's incredibly aggressive pricing. Almost seemed reckless.
But it worked. It created demand.
It created staggering demand.
Right.
There's a famous story. Burroughs, a big computer company back then, placed an order with Fairchild in 1966 for 20 million chips.
20 million. How did that compare to, say, Apollo?
That single order was 20 times the total volume of chips the entire massive Apollo program used. So by 1968, just a few years later, the commercial sector was buying as many chips as the military. And that flood of civilian money, that's what paid for the incredibly expensive R&D needed to keep shrinking transistors year after year, decade after decade.
So the pattern was set. Government sparks it. Consumer market fans the flames into a bonfire.
That's a great way to put it. That commercial scale became the engine of Moore's Law. Right, so the next chapter really brings in the geopolitics directly. And it starts with the first real chip competition. It shows us why certain economic systems just couldn't keep up, Let's look at the Soviet Union's attempt. It was kind of a disaster, honestly.
Because they try to just copy everything, right? The top-down approach.
Exactly. There's this almost legendary story about the Soviet minister of the electronics industry, Alexander Shokin.
Yeah.
He somehow got his hands on an American chip, a Texas Instruments SN51 integrated circuit. And his order to his engineers who were setting up this sort of Soviet Silicon Valley in a city called Zelenograd.
Yeah. What was the order?
It was blunt. Copy it, 1 for 1. No deviations at all. You have 3 months.
Just clone it.
Just clone it. And, I mean, that entire approach was just fundamentally doomed from the start. Why? Because of Moore's Law itself.
Because the target was always moving?
Constantly moving.
Yeah.
Think about it. The Soviet system was incredibly bureaucratic, slow, compartmentalized, super secretive. Let's say it took them a whole year, maybe longer, to successfully steal a design, figure out how it worked, reverse engineer it, and finally produce a copy.
Okay.
By the time they finished that one chip, TI and Fairchild back in the US, they'd already gone through maybe 2 more generations of Moore's Law, doubling the density twice.
So they were always copying yesterday's technology.
Always. It's like trying to win a race by constantly looking at where your opponent was a lap ago. In an exponential industry like chips, stealing last year's design is just, it's a guaranteed losing strategy. They were perpetually stuck behind the curve.
And it wasn't just about being slow, was it? There were deeper technical problems, too.
Oh, yeah. Fundamental problems. We talked about doping earlier, adding impurities to silicon.
Right, to make it work as a switch.
Well, to do that reliably, you need silicon wafers that are unbelievably pure to begin with. Like impurities measured in parts per billion. The Soviet industrial system, it just wasn't set up for that kind of material science precision. They lacked the purity, they lacked the extreme clean room discipline you needed for high-yield, reliable chip making.
And the way innovation happened was different, too.
Totally different. In Silicon Valley, you had this informal, constant chatter. Engineers moving between companies, sharing ideas, constant feedback loops on the factory floor. The Soviet system was rigid, top-down. And crucially, their whole effort was geared towards military applications.
No consumer market driving volume.
Pretty much none. Consumer goods were an afterthought, often terrible quality. Yeah. So they completely missed out on that massive civilian market, the engine that was pouring money back into R&D in the West. It was a systemic failure, tied directly to their economic model.
And this had real consequences for their military, even if it took a while for them to see it.
Devastating consequences, ultimately. Yeah. Because their domestic chip industry just couldn't produce reliable advanced dupes in volume, Soviet weapons designers were actually taught to use less complex electronics in their tanks, missiles, planes.
They were deliberately designing dumber weapons.
Potentially, yes.
Yeah.
They had to design around the limitations of their own components, which guaranteed their systems would lag behind the increasingly sophisticated, smarter systems the U.S. was building.
And someone in their military hierarchy eventually realized this was a huge problem.
A very influential figure, Marshal Ogarkov. He was a top Soviet military thinker in the late 70s, early 80s. He saw what was happening. He looked at how the U.S. was using things like paveway laser-guided bombs powered by semiconductors in conflicts like Vietnam.
Precision strikes.
Exactly. Ogarkov realized this wasn't just incremental improvement. America's chip-powered precision weapons had created a genuine military technical revolution. He saw it as an existential threat. The Soviets might have more tanks on paper, but the U.S. systems were becoming vastly more accurate and effective. The failure to master the chip, Ogarkov argued, actually threatened the long-term survival of the Soviet state itself.
Wow. So the Soviets failed trying to copy, but then the U.S. faced a completely different kind of challenge, right? Not theft, but industrial competition from Japan.
Precisely. The next chip war wasn't ideological, it was economic. Moving into the 1970s and 80s, Japan mounted an incredibly effective challenge.
They were really transforming their image then, weren't they?
Absolutely. People like Akio Morita at Sony were leading this charge. They systematically changed the global perception of made in Japan from meaning cheap, low-quality knockoffs to meaning high-quality, reliable electronics. Think transistor radios first, then TVs, VCRs.
And then they set their sights on the core components, the chips themselves.
They did. Specifically, they targeted DRAM dynamic random access memory chips. These are the workhorse memory chips every computer needs.
And how did they manage to compete so effectively against the established U.S. companies?
Their strategy was pretty straightforward, actually.
Yeah.
Invest heavily in manufacturing. In the early 80s, Japanese semiconductor firms were pouring like 60% more money into production equipment and factories than their American competitors,
Just outspending them on the tools.
massively outspending them. And it worked spectacularly well for DRAM. Japan quickly became the dominant global supplier of memory chips, and not just the chips themselves. By the late 80s, Japanese companies also supplied something like 70% of the world's lithography equipment.
Whoa, the machines to make the chips. That sounds critical.
It was critical. Lithography machines are these incredibly complex optical tools that etch the circuit patterns onto the silicon wafers.
Yeah.
If Japan controlled the supply of those machines, they potentially controlled the future of the entire industry.
So how did Silicon Valley react to this? Were they worried?
Worried. They were panicking. You had CEOs like Jerry Sanders, the founder of AMD, literally declaring, "We're at war with Japan." An economic war fought with technology, productivity, and quality. They started calling chips the crude oil of the 1980s, absolutely essential, and suddenly feeling vulnerable.
But hang on, wasn't Japan mostly dominating DRAM, which is important but kind of a commodity? Weren't U.S. companies like Intel still leading in the more complex, higher profit logic chips, the microprocessors?
That's a really important distinction. And yes, you're right. Intel, Motorola, they still held the lead in microprocessors, the brains of the computer. The panic sometimes conflated memory and logic.
Okay.
But from a national security perspective, the worry was still very real. It wasn't just about losing the DRAM market share. It was about the dependence. Dependence on Japanese memory chips? Yes. But even more critically, dependence on Japanese manufacturing equipment.
The lithography machines.
Exactly. The Pentagon started asking serious questions. What if there's a crisis? Could Japan restrict access to those critical machines needed to make any advanced chip, including the ones for our weapon systems? The fear was the U.S. military could become completely dependent on overseas manufacturers for its most vital technology.
So this wasn't just commercial competition. It was seen as a strategic vulnerability.
Absolutely. And that fear led directly to a major U.S. government response, the creation of Semitech in the late 80s.
What was Semitech?
It was this big government industry consortium. They poured money into joint research, specifically aiming to revitalize the American semiconductor manufacturing equipment industry, especially lithography. They even brought legends like Bob Noyce and Jack Kilby back into the fold to help lead it.
So even with an ally like Japan, the U.S. felt it needed domestic capacity for strategic reasons.
It confirmed that, yeah. Even in peacetime, control over chip technology, and especially the means of producing that technology, was being treated as fundamental to national security. That lesson would become even more relevant later on.
Okay, so the U.S. sort of fended off the Japanese challenge, partly through things like Semitech. But then the whole landscape shifted again, didn't it? And this time, the center of gravity moved decisively towards Asia, specifically Taiwan.
That's right. And the Taiwan story is fascinating because it was partly a deliberate, long-term strategy linking economic development directly to national security.
How so?
There was this influential Taiwanese official, KT Lee. He looked at Taiwan's precarious geopolitical situation, especially as U.S. security commitments in Asia seemed to fluctuate over the decades. He had this really insightful idea.
What was the idea?
He basically reasoned, if Taiwan could make itself absolutely indispensable to the global economy, particularly to American industry, then the U.S. would have a much stronger self-interest in defending Taiwan.
Make yourself too important to fail economically.
Exactly. He famously believed that American executives worried about protecting their investments in, say, Texas Instruments facilities in Taiwan would be powerful voices arguing for Taiwan's security back in Washington. It was the seed of the Silicon Shield concept.
And U.S. companies did start investing there early on.
Texas Instruments actually set up a packaging and testing facility in Taiwan way back in 1969. They saw it as having a good business climate, stable politics, and frankly, low wages at the time.
But the real game changer for Taiwan came later, with one specific person and one specific company.
Morris Chang and TSMC. This is a pivotal moment. Chang was a veteran executive from Texas Instruments. He saw that the traditional model of chip companies called integrated device manufacturers, or IDMs, like Intel or TI back then, was becoming a bottleneck.
What was the bottleneck?
These IDMs did everything in-house, designed the chips, and manufactured them in their own expensive factories, fabs. Chang realized that designing chips and manufacturing chips were becoming two vastly different, incredibly complex specializations. And the cost of building new fabs was skyrocketing because of Moore's law.
So it was getting too expensive for everyone to do everything.
Exactly. So in 1987, Chang founded TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, and he created the world's first dedicated semiconductor foundry.
Meaning they only manufactured chips? They didn't design their own?
Precisely. That was the foundry revolution. TSMC's entire business model was, you design the chip, we'll manufacture it for you. We won't compete with you by designing our own chips. We are purely your manufacturing partner.
And this enabled a whole new type of company to emerge.
Thousands of them. This created the fabless semiconductor industry. Companies that only focus on chip design, brilliant innovators like Nvidia, Qualcomm, Broadcom, AMD. Eventually, they could suddenly exist and thrive without needing to spend billions and billions of dollars building their own factories.
Wow. So it massively lowered the barrier to entry for chip design innovation.
Dramatically. Think about it. Suddenly, a couple of smart engineers in a garage or university lab could design the next world-beating chip, and they could actually get it made by TSMC without needing venture capital in the tens of billions just to build a fab. It decoupled manufacturing complexity from design innovation.
And this model really concentrated manufacturing in Taiwan around TSMC.
It did. Chang was very strategic about building what he called the Grand Alliance. TSMC positioned itself as this neutral, reliable partner for everyone. Their absolute core promise, especially compared to competitors like Samsung or Intel, who also design their own chips, was, we will never steal your design. Your intellectual property is safe with us.
That trust was crucial.
Absolutely indispensable. It meant that fewer competitors think Apple, Nvidia, AMD could all rely on TSMC without fearing their secrets would leak. It also meant equipment makers from the US, Japan, Europe, material suppliers, they all clustered around TSMC as this central hub.
And the combined R&D power of this network became immense.
It dwarfed even the giants like Intel or Samsung. TSMC's own R&D spending, plus the R&D of its biggest customers who were pushing the limits of design, created this ecosystem that just accelerated faster than the old integrated model could keep up with, especially for the most advanced chips.
So TSMC became the specialist in the really complex, high-value stuff.
Exactly. They focused on the cutting-edge logic chips, the processors, the GPUs, the brains of devices. They largely left the lower-margin, more commoditized memory chips like DRAM to the South Korean companies like Samsung and SK Hynix.
And the result was this massive geographic shift in where chips actually get made.
Undeniable.
Yeah.
If you look at the U.S. share of global chip fabrication, in 1990, it was around 37%. Pretty strong.
Okay.
By 2000, it had fallen to 19%. And by 2010, it was only 13%. A huge drop.
13%. And where did the advanced stuff go?
Today, the manufacturing of the most advanced logic chips, we're talking 7 nanometers, 5 nanometers, now moving to 3 nanometers. It's basically monopolized by just 3 companies, TSMC in Taiwan, Samsung in South Korea, and Intel, which is trying desperately to catch up but is primarily US-based. But TSMC has the lion's share of the cutting-edge foundry market.
And this concentration has huge implications for pretty much all modern tech. You mentioned Nvidia earlier.
Nvidia is a perfect example of a fabless giant. Their GPUs, their graphics processing units, were first designed for, making video games look amazing.
Right. High-end gaming cards.
But it turned out that the architecture of those GPUs doing lots of calculations in parallel was absolutely perfect for training artificial intelligence models.
Ah, the AI revolution runs on gaming hardware, essentially.
In a way, yes. Nvidia suddenly found itself providing the core engines for AI. They became America's most valuable semiconductor company by market cap. But crucially, they don't make their own chips. Their entire business, their hundreds of billions in value, depends almost entirely on TSMC being able to physically produce those incredibly complex GPUs for them, reliably and at scale.
So why did it become so concentrated? Why couldn't more countries or companies just build their own advanced fabs?
Money and mind-bending complexity. Building just one cutting-edge semiconductor fab today costs around $20 billion.
$20 billion for one factory.
Yep. That's roughly twice the cost of a brand new Ford-class aircraft carrier.
Good grief. What makes them so expensive?
It's everything. The buildings themselves need foundations maybe 30 feet deep to dampen vibrations to an infinitesimal level. The clean rooms have air filtered far beyond hospital operating room standards. They use ultra-pure water, filtered down to the parts per trillion level. And then there's the equipment inside, especially those EUV lithography machines we'll talk about later. Each one costs over $150 million.
Okay, so the upfront cost is just astronomical.
And because the cost is so high, you need absolutely massive production volume running through that fab 24/7 just to make the economics work, just to get the cost per chip down to a competitive level. Only companies with huge global scale like TSMC or Samsung can guarantee that kind of volume.
So the economics just drove consolidation. Smaller players couldn't compete.
It made consolidation pretty much inevitable. The result is the entire world, for its most advanced, most critical technology is now deeply structurally dependent on a tiny handful of companies located in a very specific and potentially volatile part of the world. And that dependence leads us directly to the most urgent part of this story, the current situation with China. China has made it crystal clear it's a national priority. You hear it in phrases like "Made in China 2025."
Right, self-sufficiency in key technologies.
Exactly. President Xi Jinping has explicitly called for the country to storm the passes, basically conquer the choke points in core technologies. And semiconductors are right at the top of that list. They see mastering chip production as vital for their economy, their military, their whole national standing.
But how are they actually doing? After all these years of huge government investment pushing this goal, where does China stand in terms of its own domestic chip capability?
Well, despite pouring hundreds of billions of dollars into it, China is still remarkably dependent on the outside world for the most important chips.
Really? Still?
Yeah. If you look at the overall global semiconductor market, China's domestic production only accounts for maybe 6% of global supply. And if you're talking about the really cutting-edge stuff, the 5 nanometer, 3 nanometer logic chips you need for the latest smartphones, for advanced AI servers, China has almost no capability to produce those at scale.
So where do they get them from?
They rely heavily on imports and foreign technology across the entire chain. They need U.S. companies for the crucial software used to design chips. They need incredibly complex machinery for manufacturing, which comes mostly from the U.S., the Netherlands, and Japan. And for the actual manufacturing of the most advanced chips, they depend on Taiwan and South Korea, primarily TSMC and Samsung.
So deep dependence across the board for the high end. But China's been very good at leveraging global tech for its own goals, right? This idea of civil-military fusion.
Extremely effective historically. The whole idea of civil-military fusion is to break down barriers so that the technology developed in the civilian sector can be rapidly adopted and used by the People's Liberation Army, the PLA.
And how did that play out with chips before recent restrictions? Was the PLA getting access to advanced Western chips?
Alarmingly easily, it turns out. There was a study that looked at over 300 publicly available PLA procurement contracts related to artificial intelligence.
Okay.
What it found was pretty shocking. Initially, less than 20% of those AI-related contracts involved Chinese companies that were actually subject to U.S. export controls at the time.
So what does that mean? Where were they getting the chips?
It means the PLA wasn't waiting around for some hypothetical specialized Chinese military chip to be developed. They were just going out and buying powerful, cutting-edge, general-purpose commercial chips, the high-end CPUs and GPUs from American companies like Intel, AMD, Nvidia, basically off the shelf.
Just buying them commercially?
Yeah, buying them through distributors, integrating them into their own AI systems, their weapons platforms, surveillance systems. Essentially, without strong controls, the PLA was set to acquire a huge amount of the computing power it needed for its modernization simply by being a customer of Silicon Valley.
Okay, that's a massive vulnerability from a U.S. perspective. Selling the tech that powers your rival's military buildup.
It became seen as an unacceptable vulnerability. And that realization drove a huge strategic shift in U.S. policy over the last few years. Instead of trying to track every single chip sale, the strategy shifted to controlling the critical, unavoidable choke points in the global supply chain.
Using the structure of the industry itself as a weapon.
Exactly. It's been called a devastatingly powerful weapon because it leverages the areas where the U.S. and its key allies still hold unique, almost monopolistic control.
Okay, so what are these choke points?
There are really two main ones that are incredibly powerful. The first is software. Designing a modern chip is unbelievably complex. You can't do it with pencil and paper. You need highly specialized software called electronic design automation, or EDA tools. And the global market for the most advanced, most critical EDA software is totally dominated by just 3 companies, all American. Cadence and Synopsys, based in California, and Mentor Graphics, which is technically owned by Siemens now, but its core EDA operations are based in Oregon.
So if you want to design any advanced chip anywhere in the world,
you basically have to use software licensed from one of those 3 U.S. firms. There are no real alternatives for the cutting edge. If the U.S. government tells those companies they can't sell licenses to a specific Chinese firm, that firm simply cannot design its next generation of advanced chips. Full stop. It's a gatekeeper role.
Okay, that's software. What's the second choke point?
The second one is the physical manufacturing equipment, specifically for lithography. We talked about etching patterns. To make the microscopic transistors on today's most advanced chips, you need a technology called extreme ultraviolet, or EUV, lithography.
EUV, I've heard of that. It's incredibly complex.
mind-bendingly complex. These EUV machines are arguably the most sophisticated, intricate machines humans have ever built. And guess what? They are produced by only one company in the entire world.
One company. Who?
A Dutch company called ASML. They have a complete global monopoly on EUV lithography systems. No one else can make them.
So ASML holds the key to advanced chip manufacturing.
They do, but here's another layer of dependence. ASML, even though they're Dutch, relies on critical components from other countries, including the US. Specifically, the unique light source needed to generate that EUV light.
The light source. What's special about it?
It's produced by a company called Cymer, which ASML owns, but it's based in San Diego, California. The process is insane. They use incredibly powerful lasers to blast tiny droplets of molten tin, vaporizing them 50,000 times per second.
50,000 times a second. Why?
To create a plasma that emits exactly the right wavelength of extreme ultraviolet light needed for the lithography process. It's an unbelievably complex piece of physics and engineering, and that critical light source technology is American.
So the U.S. has leverage even over the Dutch company that makes the key machines.
Significant leverage. Without that U.S.-sourced Cymer light engine, ASML can't build the EUV machines. Without the EUV machines, fabs in Taiwan or Korea run by TSMC or Samsung can't produce the world's most advanced chips. It's another critical choke point.
And we saw this strategy deployed very publicly against Huawei, right?
The Huawei case was the textbook example of how this works. In 2019 and 2020, the U.S. put Huawei and its chip design subsidiary, Silicon, on the entity list, restricting their access to U.S. technology.
Okay. But Huawei was getting its advanced chips made by TSMC in Taiwan, not in the U.S. So how did U.S. rules stop that?
That's the crucial part. Even though TSMC is Taiwanese, their manufacturing process relies on two things subject to U.S. export controls. One, American EDA software to work with Huawei's designs, and two, manufacturing equipment, including ASML's EUV machines, which contain U.S. components like the Cymer light source.
Ah, the foreign direct product rule.
Exactly. The U.S. essentially said, if you, TSMC, use U.S. origin software or tools anywhere in your process to make chips for Huawei, you are violating our export controls. And TSMC, needing access to that software and those tools for all its customers, had no choice but to comply. They immediately had to stop manufacturing all advanced chips for Huawei.
And the impact on Huawei was?
Instantaneous and devastating. Their ability to produce cutting-edge smartphones collapsed. They had to sell off their Honor smartphone brand. Their 5G network equipment business was severely hampered globally. It was a surgical strike using these technological choke points. It perfectly demonstrated this concept of weaponized interdependence.
Using the global supply chain structure itself as leverage. Which brings us right back to the biggest vulnerability of all, Taiwan's central role.
Precisely. That silicon shield that KT Lei envisioned, it's definitely a source of protection, makes Taiwan incredibly important, but also makes it a massive potential target or point of leverage in a conflict.
What would happen if there were, say, a military conflict or even just a blockade around Taiwan? The economic fallout sounds unimaginable.
Catastrophic is probably the right word. Global scale catastrophe, unlike anything since maybe World War II. Just looking at the immediate impact, estimates suggest roughly 1/3 of the entire world's processing power for PCs chips designed by Apple, AMD, Intel, Qualcomm would instantly go offline because they're made by TSMC.
1/3 of computers stop getting new brains.
Instantly. And beyond PCs, think about 5G. The global rollout of 5G networks relies massively on components manufactured in Taiwan. That would essentially grind to a complete halt worldwide. No more 5G expansion. It wouldn't just be a shortage. It would be like hitting the brakes on the entire trajectory of global technological progress.
We got a small taste of what chip dependence means with Russia after the Ukraine invasion, didn't we?
A very grim taste. Russia's own domestic semiconductor industry was, frankly, in terrible shape after years of neglect and sanctions. When broader sanctions hit after the invasion, cutting off access to Western chips, what happened?
What did happen?
There were reports, pretty credible ones, that Russian defense factories were actually resorting to scavenging chips from imported civilian goods. They were apparently pulling microcontrollers out of things like dishwashers and washing machines.
No way. Dishwasher chips in missiles.
And putting those relatively simple, non-military grade chips into their missile guidance systems and other military hardware because they had nothing else. That's the stark reality of what happens when you lose access to the chips you need, especially for defense.
That really paints a picture of vulnerability.
And it highlights the ultimate nightmare scenario, the question hanging over Taiwan and the entire global economy. Imagine Beijing decides, not on a full-scale invasion, but maybe imposes a partial naval blockade. Enough pressure to really hurt Taiwan's economy.
Okay.
And then they make demands. They say to TSMC, number one, you must immediately restart chip production for our designated Chinese companies. And number two, you must begin transferring your key manufacturing know-how, maybe even key personnel, to facilities on the mainland.
Faced with military pressure from China and economic pressure from the rest of the world desperate for chips, could Taiwan say no?
That is the terrifying multi-trillion-dollar question. Could they resist that kind of pressure? The fate of the global high-tech economy, in many ways, hangs on the answer to that hypothetical but potentially very real challenge. Hashtag tag outro.
Okay, let's try to pull this all together. We've covered a lot of ground, from vacuum tubes to dishwasher chips and missiles. What's the main takeaway here?
I think the absolute core takeaway is just how fragile and concentrated the foundation of our modern world is. Everything runs on these chips, and the manufacturing supply chain is overwhelmingly centered in just one small part of the world, East Asia, especially Taiwan and South Korea.
Right, and that concentration creates immense vulnerability for everyone, the U.S., Europe, China itself. Everyone's exposed to shocks in that region, particularly around the Taiwan Strait.
And while the U.S. might have lost its dominance in actually making the highest volume of chips, especially the most advanced ones.
Yeah, that 13% figure is stark.
It is. But the U.S. retains this really powerful asymmetric leverage through those choke points we discussed. Control over the essential design software, control over key aspects of the irreplaceable manufacturing machinery, plus the security alliances that protect the countries housing the fabs.
So the old ideas about globalization, that technology would just spread everywhere freely, that hasn't really happened in this industry.
Not at all. If anything, we've seen the opposite. The rhetoric was diffusion, but the reality has been concentration, you could call it Taiwanization, for the most advanced logic chips and monopolization of key tools and software. It's proven far stickier and more controllable than simple free market theory might suggest.
Okay, so here's the final thought, the provocation maybe, to leave everyone with. We've seen this history. Military needs, then commercial scale, then geopolitical competition. Now it feels like we're entering a phase where the pure logic of commercial efficiency, just making the best chip at the lowest cost, wherever that happens to be, is crashing headlong into national security imperatives.
Absolutely. The two forces are pulling in opposite directions now.
So what happens next? What happens when the geopolitical goals of the countries controlling these choke points, primarily the U.S. and its close allies, start to seriously diverge from what the global commercial market needs or wants?
That's the critical question. When security starts to trump efficiency, when nations are willing to pay more or even sacrifice some performance to ensure their supply chains are secure or to deny technology to rivals, what does that world look like?
It suggests this competition over these tiny, tiny switches, those literally quintillions of transistors being made each year, is far from over. It's probably only going to get more intense.
I think that's almost certain. It really underscores that the story of the chip isn't just about amazing science and engineering. It's always been deeply intertwined with sales strategy, with government policy, with grand geopolitical strategy, and ultimately with raw power.
The hidden circuitry, as you said, dictating the flow of power in the 21st century. A lot to think about.